Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. I've talked a lot in my lens videos about Zuiko lenses, and there's usually one that features in each lineup. So today I'm going to show you my 5 favourite Zuiko lenses that can be used either with an OM SLR or a digital mirrorless camera. The Zuikos are some of the best lenses available from the film days. They have wonderful colour rendition. They're really small and compact, they're very well made, and they're relatively cheap. There were many different Zuiko lenses made. Some of them are quite expensive, others are much more affordable. So here are my 5 best picks for affordable Zuiko lenses that you can buy today and use on a digital mirrorless body. So to begin with, we're going to look at this lovely little lens. This is the 28mm f3.5. There are wider Zuiko lenses that you can get. There's a 24mm and there are even wider ones than that. But as you go wider, the expense starts to become greater. So this one, I think, is a good compromise between field of view and cost. There are Zuiko 28mm with a wider aperture. I believe some go to f2 and perhaps even beyond that. They'll give you more light gathering capability and they'll also give you a slightly shallower depth of field. But shallow depth of field is not usually a priority with a wide angle lens, so that's probably not too much of a penalty. There's no doubt that this is a lovely little lens. I really like it. I haven't had it very long and I've been playing with it recently, and it's given me some really nice results. One of the great things about a wide-angle lens is that they're really useful for street photography, and that's because they have very large depth of field. So that's a really useful feature. This lens will focus down to 30 centimeters, so you can get very close to your subject. And the focusing throw itself is really small on this lens. That's just over a quarter of a turn, perhaps a third of a turn. And that's a really useful quality. Like all the Zuiko lenses, this one renders colours very nicely indeed. And while it does have a very large depth of field, if you get close to your subject, you can get some blurry background of a very nice quality. Apertures on this lens run from f3.5 to f16. And because it's such a small lens, if you're using it on a digital mirrorless camera like the Sony A7 or one of the Micro Four Thirds cameras, even with an adapter, it still keeps the whole thing within manageable proportions. I really like this lens a lot, and the fact that it's quite cheap makes it even better. You can pick a good one of these up for around £50 to £60 or thereabouts. And for me, this one's definitely a keeper. Sometimes a 28mm is a bit too wide and a 50mm is a bit too long. So in those situations, a lens with a 35mm focal length fills the gap nicely. This is the Zuiko 35mm f2.8 lens, and it's a very nice lens indeed. It's a lens I've used a lot recently, and I've found it to be very well made. I've found it to render colours very nicely indeed. It's very sharp where it needs to be sharp, and if you get close to your subject, it'll give you a very nice, soft, blurry background. Like all the Zuikos, it's all metal in its construction, so it will last a long time and it's very well made. And again, like all the Zuikos, it's a very small lens. So when mounted on a digital mirrorless camera, even with an adapter, the rig is still fairly small. The throw of the focus ring is not that great at all. In fact, it's about half a turn, so a little more than the 28mm, but still entirely usable and manageable. It will focus down to 30 centimeters, so you can get very close to your subject. And although it does have less depth of field than the 28mm, if you set to 5.6 or f8, that will increase the depth of field considerably, so this is still a really good lens for street shooting. Apertures run from f2.8 to f16, Like all the Zuiko lenses, this aperture has click stops, so it may not be the ideal lens for video. Having said that, however, I've shot a lot of video and I've never really found it necessary to change the aperture setting during a shot. A stepless aperture is slightly better for video, but I've never really found the clicks to be a handicap. The quality of the images that you can get with this lens are nothing short of beautiful, and I really do think that word applies. It's sharp, but the background blur is soft. It renders colours really nicely. It can get very close to a subject. Sometimes it's difficult to say exactly why images are so nice with any particular lens, but the combination of factors with this lens, sharpness, softness of out of focus areas, rendition of colour, all those factors add up in this lens to give an image that is really an extraordinary one. This lens has another advantage over comparable 35mm lenses from other manufacturers in that it tends to be rather cheaper. You can find a good example of this lens for between £60 to £80. I very much like this lens and it's definitely a keeper. Now here's a lens in a focal length no photographer should be without. This is the Zuiko 50mm f1.4. This is certainly one of my favourite lenses. It may even be my favourite lens. It's taken the place of the Helios 44 that used to be almost permanently attached to my Sony A7. This is the lens that I'll use more often than not if I take my camera out for a day's shooting. It's an absolutely lovely lens, and that maximum aperture means you get loads of blurry background of a very, very pleasing quality. It's really soft at longer distances. At shorter distances, point light sources become bubbles, a little bit like the Jupiter 8, which again is a lens with very nice bokeh. This is a delicious lens. I've used it for landscapes, I've used it for portraits, I've used it for all points betwixt and between. It's very versatile, it's very well made, it renders colours beautifully, and it's a deserved favourite. It really is lovely. The throw of the focus ring is around about 3/4 of a turn, and the close focusing distance is 45 centimeters, so you can get pretty close to your subject with this lens. It does extend a little at the closest focus distance, but all in all this is a very compact lens and it won't look too big on your mirrorless camera. Apertures run from 1.4 all the way round to f16, so you've got a very wide range of aperture settings, and this lens is great in low light. It can be a little difficult to focus if you're shooting wide open, and that may have led to criticisms of this lens as not quite as sharp as the Zuiko 50mm f1.8. I've never found it to be lacking in sharpness as long as you get the focus right. If your eyesight isn't perfect, as is the case with me, it helps enormously to have focus peaking, and while most of the modern digital mirrorless cameras do have that feature, there are some that don't, so that's something to bear in mind. I've used this lens extensively over the past year or so, and I'm very impressed indeed with it. The earlier silver nose versions of this lens are said to be not quite as sharp, but I've never found that to be a problem. I've had the silver nose version, and this one is a black nosed version, one of the later models, but I see no difference in performance between the two of them. I've not subjected them to scientific tests because, frankly, that's boring. I can say, however, that in ordinary day-to-day use, this lens is a gem. It's very sharp, it renders colours beautifully, and the quality of that background blur is frankly astonishing. It's really smooth, it's soft, it's all of the things that you want background blur to be. And the reason I chose this lens over the 1.8 50mm is that with the 1.8, background blur gets very slightly fussy. It's just not as smooth as the 1.4. So while you can pick up a good 1.8 50mm for anywhere between £30 to £50, this one is definitely worth the extra money. A good example of one of these can be bought for between £60 to £90 or thereabouts. If background blur isn't really your thing, then it doesn't really matter. But for me, that factor makes this lens the clear winner. This is a definite keeper. Here's another of my favourites from the Zuiko family. This is the f2.8 100mm. This is another lovely lens. It's a really nice piece of kit. Images I've made with this lens tend to be fairly low contrast. You may or may not like the low contrast look. Personally, I like it very much. There's another 100mm lens in the Zuiko range, and it's an f2 lens. However, that lens is very expensive, and I find the f2.8 a good compromise. This lens has beautiful colour rendition, it has very good sharpness, and because it's a long lens, it has the most amazing out of focus blur in the background. It makes a good street lens because it has that extra reach, and if you want to shoot incognito, candid shots often work the best on the street. This is a good lens to help you achieve that. The aperture range runs from f2.8 to f22, so it's good in low light. As usual with the Zuiko lenses, the aperture has click stops. The focus throw is around about a whole turn on this lens, and minimum focusing distance is 1 meter. However, because it's a long lens, that doesn't matter too much. In the Zuiko tradition, this is a very small lens, and for a 100mm lens, it's truly tiny. It's not much bigger than the 50mm lens we just looked at, and you can see that at infinity, the 100mm lens is perhaps a centimetre or so longer than the 50mm. Both of these lenses are wearing filters at the moment, so if we take those off, we can see their true dimensions, and we can see that this 100mm is a very small lens indeed. So, as with the previous Zuikos we've looked at, this lens too will not make your mirrorless camera unfeasibly large when it's mounted with an adapter. This is an absolutely gorgeous lens. It's light and small enough to carry about with you. It has a good bit of reach. It has fantastic blurry background, and as with most longer lenses, it's a great lens for portraits. If you're looking for a good vintage 100mm lens that won't break the bank, good examples of this one can be found for between £50 to £70 or thereabouts. It's a great little piece of glass, and for me, it's definitely a keeper. So the final lens in my 5 best Zuiko lenses is this one. This is the 135mm f3.5. This is a really nice lens, and one that I've really come to appreciate after having used it for the past 6 months or so. It's not particularly fast at f3.5, however, because it's a long lens, it will give you plenty of blurry background, and it will separate your subjects from the background even when the distance between yourself and the subject is fairly large. Personally, I love a bit of blurry background, and this lens certainly delivers the goods. It makes a fantastic portrait lens, but it's also really good for street shooting because it has a little reach, and you can get close up to a subject without actually being close to them. Like all the Zuikos, its colour rendition is second to none. It's very, very well made, and it's also really sharp. It will flare if you're shooting into the sun, but it does have a rather nice, handy, built-in lens hood, which extends very easily with a nice smooth action and retracts in the same way. The quality of the images it can make is beautiful. It's a lovely lens, and for situations where you need that extra reach, this is the lens I go to. For a 135mm lens, it's actually really small. Most of the competitors' lenses are a third to a half as long again. And compactness in lenses is a really great advantage, especially if you're using it with a mirrorless digital camera, because you will always need to use an adapter, and they add about an inch and a half. So the smaller the actual lens, the better. The focusing throw on this lens is about a turn, and the closest focusing distance is 1.5 meters. This one's slightly tricky to turn when you get near infinity. I think it may need a little lubrication. Generally speaking, the Zuiko lenses are quite good in that regard. They don't tend to need lubricating after many years of use. This one seems to be the exception that proves the rule. However, even though it's a little stiff at points, it's still entirely usable. Apertures run from f3.5 at the wide end to f22 when fully stopped down, so there's a very good range of apertures there. I like this little lens very much indeed. It gives really nice results. It's compact enough to carry with you. It's not particularly heavy for what it is. It's very sharp. It renders colours beautifully, and the quality of any out of focus areas in the background is very, very soft indeed. I don't generally shoot with lenses longer than 135mm, and the reason for that is, beyond that length, they do start to become very large lenses indeed. Personally, I find it a little bit impractical to have anything longer than this lens mounted on a mirrorless body. So that's why this is the maximum focal length in my selection of the 5 best Zuiko primes. It is a little bulkier than the 100mm, which we just looked at. That is a very small lens indeed for what it is. But even so, this lens is entirely usable, and I've never felt that my camera kit was too bulky with this lens mounted. I've made a lot of images with this lens that I find very pleasing indeed. I love the way it renders images. It's also a very cheap lens. A good example of this lens will cost between £30 and £50, possibly less. At that price, you just can't go wrong. And again, for me, this one is most definitely a keeper. So there we are, my 5 best affordable Zuiko primes. You can put this range of lenses together for under £400, and you're going to have a very capable, very competent kit of vintage glass. These lenses are at least as good as modern primes, at least in my experience they are. They're very small, they're very affordable, they render colours beautifully, and if you're looking to build up a kit of vintage primes, with these lenses you just cannot go wrong. I'd like to thank everybody who watches these videos, everybody who's subscribed and liked the videos. Please do like and subscribe if you've enjoyed this one. It makes it much easier for me to continue producing the videos. So that's all from me for now, and I will see you next time for more Zenography. Thanks for watching.